Hello, I'm Lisa Ram, host of Morning Edition on WABE in Atlanta. Welcome to the Atlanta Press Club Louder Milk Young Debate Series from the studios of Georgia Public Broadcasting. This is the general election debate among candidates for Secretary of State. Let's meet the candidates for this debate. They are, in alphabetical order, Ted Metz, a libertarian who is a retired entrepreneur; Nguyen, a Democrat who serves as the Georgia House Representative for District 89. Brad Raffensperger, a Republican, is the incumbent Secretary of State here in Georgia. Now, let's meet our panelists. Matt Brown is a democracy reporter on Georgia elections for the Washington Post. Welcome. And Mark Nisi covers elections and Georgia government for the Atlanta Journal-Constitutional. Thank you for being here. For complete rules on today's debate, please visit the Atlanta Press Club website, atlantapressclub.org/debates. To start this debate, each candidate will be asked one question. Candidates have 60 seconds to answer each question. Mark Nisi, you get the first question to Ted Metz.
Good morning. Mr. Metz, you have talked about your desire to not just have paper ballots cast on paper, but also counted by hand on paper rather than using optical scanner machines. But hand counting ballots would take longer, and studies and research show that hand counting ballots is less accurate than counting them by scanning machines. Why do you think hand counting ballots would increase voter confidence?
Because humans generally have a tendency to want to be honest. The thing is, they do it in France, where they have over 42 million voters. They go to election day, it's all hand counted at the precinct level, and the election results are done that night. So I don't know where you're coming up with the studies that indicate that hand counting ballots would take any longer. We already have ballot marking devices that actually do accurately reflect the voters' intent for their candidates. There's no reason that we can't hand count the paper ballots. Even if we do use an optical scanner that is used to actually look at the votes, not the QR code, which is an illegal addition to our ballots, we'd still have a much better idea of what the accurate count of the ballots were or is. Because once you put things into a computer system, your votes become a fractionalized, manipulated data point, not an actual vote.
Mr. Metz, thank you. Matt Brown, it's your turn to ask a question to Nguyen.
Thank you. Representative Nguyen, after the 2020 election, Georgia election workers endured death threats, harassment, and lawsuits, making these positions less desirable and even more important. Because poll workers have such a direct impact on elections, should the Secretary of State's office be more involved in recruiting and protecting poll workers?
Absolutely. Now, when we talk about what is happening with our election administration, we need a comprehensive plan. And it's important to also understand that after the passage of Senate Bill 202, the workload on our local election boards and our election workers has increased while the funding has decreased. So what we're looking at is more and more people are leaving because they don't have the adequate resources to administer free and fair elections in all 159 counties, and poll workers are being threatened and harassed. We need a comprehensive plan to make sure that our local election boards are well-resourced, well-equipped. We need to repeal the provisions of Senate Bill 202 that have added additional burden on our election workers, including having to spend critical time going over these mass voter challenges. At least 65,000 Georgians have been challenged, and we need a plan in place to protect poll workers and their family members, which Senator Ossoff has introduced federal legislation to do so.
Representative Nguyen, thank you. Mark, your question for Brad Raffensperger.
Here in Georgia, we have seen these voter challenges, over 65,000 this year, challenging voters' eligibility to participate in Georgia elections based on information that they might have moved to another state. Secretary Raffensperger, this was enhanced under Georgia's voting law passed last year, allowing an unlimited number of challenges, resulting in these tens of thousands of challenges. Do you support these type of voter challenges, the ability for voters to question the eligibility of their neighbors?
Thank you, Mark. It is in everyone's interest, and I think everyone would share that same interest, that we have accurate voter rolls. But that said, frivolous challenges just gum up the works. And if I was living in one location for the last 10 or 20 years, I'd be offended also. So I think that there needs to be some reform in the next session. But I want all voters to understand that we live in a very dynamic, mobile society. 11 to 13% of all Georgians move every year. With nearly 7.5 to 8 million people on the voter rolls, we're looking at 800,000 people a year that could potentially move in the state, out of the state, around the county. And so it's very important that we can update our voter rolls. And that's why I secured authority from the General Assembly to join ERIC, the Electronic Registration Information Center, so we can update the voter rolls objectively. When you move from another state to Georgia, we let that member state of ERIC know that, so we can have updated voter rolls. I also think we should do annual list maintenance for the counties.
Secretary Raffensperger, thank you. That concludes the first round of the debate. The candidates will now ask a question of an opponent of their choice. Each candidate will have 30 seconds to ask the question, 60 seconds to respond, and the candidate who asks the question will have 30 seconds for rebuttal. By random selection, Brad Raffensperger, you may ask the first question.
My question goes to B. Nguyen. Do you agree with Stacey Abrams that the 2018 election was stolen from her, as she has claimed many, many times? Don't you think election denial is a threat to our democracy?
Well, let's be clear here. Brian Kemp won the election in 2018 and Joe Biden won the election in 2020. And I have always stood by the results of our past elections. Now, what is different between Mr. Raffensperger and me is that Stacey Abrams and I oppose laws that make it harder for Georgians to vote, including the 98-page bill that criminalizes handing out a bottle of water to a voter waiting in line. But what I find even more alarming is that Mr. Raffensperger continues to call himself a proud Trump supporter. And when asked about the lieutenant governor nominee, Burt Jones, who is a fake elector, Mr. Raffensperger, as recently as last month, described his interactions with Burt Jones as being great. We're talking about two people who tried to overturn the will of the people, and I believe that poses a greater threat than somebody who has been trying to fight for free and fair elections.
Would you like to respond?
Please. Well, I understand why you feel the need to distance yourself from those stolen election claims. But a Washington Post reporter recently stated, quote, Abrams played up claims that the election was stolen until such tactics became untenable for anyone who claims to be an advocate for American democratic norms and values. I will also point out yesterday was the first day of early voting. We had 131,000 people show up to vote, almost double what we had for the gubernatorial race 4 years ago.
Thank you very much, Mr. Raffensperger. Ted Metz, you get the next question.
All right. I would like to ask Mr. Raffensperger about the interview he did on NBC News the morning after the 2020 election, saying that 4.7 million votes had been cast, and it was the highest turnout ever, and there was only 2% of the votes left uncounted. He said that Trump had over 100,000 vote lead and only 94,000 votes were left to count, which would finish later that day, and the count would not change the outcome. Just before the feed was cut. Then days later, 4.9 million voters were certified. And the question is, why did you allow the election results be so obviously corrupted?
Please get to your question quickly.
Why did you allow the election results be so obviously corrupted?
In the 2020 race, I made sure that we had an honest and fair election, and every single ballot was counted. In fact, every single ballot that was counted through the scanners was then hand counted. We did a 100% hand recount to verify the results. And I'll stand by those results. But after the 2020 race, there was all sorts of misinformation, disinformation. And so I've been traveling all over the state, talking to you, the voter, to give you the information. Every single allegation that was raised, here's what the facts were. And I'll stand by those results, because at the end of the day, President Trump did come up short. And primarily he came up short because 24,000 Georgians skipped the presidential race, and yet they voted down ballot in other races. But we did a 100% hand recount. We audited the machines after. We checked every single allegation that was made, and those results were accurate.
Mr. Metz, would you like to respond?
Well, on that NBC interview, you said we don't guess. 4.7 million voters, Georgian voters, and there was only 2% left to count, and you said the counting would finish that day, and the outcome would not change Donald Trump's victory in Georgia. Instead, you allowed a continued counting of phantom votes for 3 days, and over 200,000 more votes were added to the results, and that changed the outcome in Georgia. So I'm probably the only candidate on the stage that would end these election shenanigans.
Mr. Metz, thank you. Nguyen, you get the final question.
Mr. Raffensperger, in 2018, when you ran for Secretary of State 4 years ago, you felt it was important to tell Georgia about your anti-choice stance. And in fact, you touted the endorsements of 2 anti-abortion groups. And during your closing debate in 2018, you said, I have a 100% rating from the Faith and Freedom Coalition. I'm pro-life. You wanted to talk about abortion back then. Why don't you want to talk about it now?
Well, your question shows that you fundamentally don't understand the role of the Secretary of State's Office of Professional Licensing. Our office provides administrative support for the boards. We don't select the boards run their shop. They are responsible for licensing, discipline, and rules. Job one is to know the job, and you don't know the job.
Ms. Nguyen, would you like to respond?
Since you don't want to talk about your record, I think it's important for Georgia voters to understand that as a lawmaker, you introduced a bill so extreme it would have outlawed all abortions and even basic forms of contraception, including IUDs and Plan B. Given the close ties to the nursing boards, it's important that nurses and other healthcare workers decide if they want to trust a staunch anti-choice Secretary of State, and the women in Georgia should decide if they want to trust a staunch anti-choice Secretary of State.
Representative Nguyen, thank you. That concludes our second round. For those just joining us, this is the general election debate between candidates for Secretary of State. We will now go back to the panel to ask questions to the candidate of their choice until we run out of time. As a point of moderator privilege, I may also ask questions of the candidates. I will then determine when a rebuttal is appropriate. Matt Brown, you get the first question in this round.
Thank you. Secretary Raffensperger, during the primary, you repeatedly told voters that Georgia elections could be undermined by non-citizens voting illegally. In March, your own office announced they found 0 ballots cast by non-Americans in recent Georgia elections. Yet for at least 3 more months, you continued campaigning on this issue. Why are you amplifying claims of voter fraud that Georgia election officials in your own office have dismissed?
I did a 100% citizenship verification of our voter rolls. We found 1,634 non-citizens who attempted to register. I believe that only American citizens should vote. I compare that somewhat to being on a jury pool. If you have to be an American citizen to be on the jury, it makes sense to me that you'd have to be an American citizen to be able to vote. And I think that 80% of all Georgians support me in that. And I want to make sure that only Americans do vote in our elections. And once you go through the process, the best day in your life will probably be when you become an American citizen, and then you get to go out and cast your ballot as an American citizen for the person that you choose to vote for.
Secretary Raffensperger, thank you. Mark Nisi, it's your turn to ask a question.
Sure. This is a question for all candidates, starting with the Secretary and moving on from him. After the 2020 presidential election, there were many investigations and recounts, and many claims of fraud have either been not proven or debunked. No counterfeit ballots have been found. The Secretary of State's office and the GBI did an audit of absentee ballot signatures, and there was a statewide hand recount, and no ineligible vote. Very few ineligible voters have been identified. I think there were 4 dead voters that were found. If each of you is elected Secretary of State, what will you do to be more transparent with the public about the status of investigations and their outcomes?
I've been very transparent. I've traveled across the state. I've been meeting with all sorts of groups, Rotary, Kiwanis, Chambers. I've said I'll talk to any group to give them the facts and the information, because we've been pushing back on election deniers since the election of 2018. So 2020 was not our first rodeo. But what we want everyone to know, that it's easy to vote in Georgia. In fact, yesterday we had record registration. But people said that there was 10,000 dead people that voted in 2020. There was only 4. Every single allegation was verified. We called in the GBI, we called in the FBI. In fact, President Trump's own hand-picked investigator looked at what happened or was alleged to have happened in State Farm, and nothing had happened. But I know that there's a lot of myths out there, and that's why I continue to speak to people. Because I think you need to understand that in Georgia, as long as I am Secretary of State, I will make sure we have honest and fair elections for everyone. I work for the voters. I don't work for political parties. I don't work for candidates. I work for the voters. I work for you.
Thank you. Nguyen.
Well, let's talk about public trust and transparency in using facts. We know that 0 non-citizens have voted in Georgia, and it's a non-issue, and it is actually an issue that has been peddled by conspiracy theorists. We also know that Sidney Powell and other Trump allies breached the Coffee County Elections Office and copied sensitive data. We actually don't know when that occurred because when the Secretary of State's office was asked about it, they gave us 3 different timelines. It's been 21 months. Nobody has been held criminally accountable. The Secretary of State's office failed to pull camera footage that would have confirmed the breach did indeed happen. And it took a year and a half to bring GBI in to investigate these claims. This is about public trust, and the Secretary of State's office mishandled that investigation. And as Secretary of State, I would be transparent with the public about what is actually happening.
Would you like to respond to that, Secretary Raffensperger?
I will. I believe that what happened in Coffee County will have a thorough investigation, and people that broke the law should be held accountable and sent to jail. When we found that Misty put her passwords up on YouTube, we began an investigation, and subsequently she resigned. Subsequently, we called in the GBI, and we have an ongoing investigation. But like I said, people broke the law. They should be investigated, held accountable, and go to jail.
Thank you. Ted Metz, would you like to respond?
I would, because there's still unresolved issues in the 2020 election, including 6 sworn affidavits from Fulton County employees saying that there were probably tens of thousands of counterfeit ballots. And even though the GBI and FBI went and helped the IG from the Secretary of State's office look through the ballots, sure, they didn't find anything, but it didn't mean it was a GBI investigation. More than 17,000 more votes were cast in Fulton County than there are ballot images to support that number of votes. Dropbox for surveillance shows about 18,000 unaccounted for votes. There's improper chain of custody votes for over 107,000 ballots statewide. Chain of custody forms are missing for over 355,000 votes statewide. 86,000 voters in the 2020 election had false registration dates of 2017, but they are not reflected in the 2017 data. Over 1.7 million original ballot images are lost or destroyed in 70 counties around the state. I'm saying that this is not credible.
Ms. Raffensperger, you are the current Secretary of State. Would you like to respond to that?
When we wrote House Bill 316 and brought in the verifiable paper ballot, what we said the official ballot is the paper ballot. And we have the paper ballots. They are on file. They are on record. We did a 100% hand recount, and we got the results that we got.
I'd like to ask all of you, the new election law here in Georgia allows for unlimited challenges of voter registrations. Thus far, there have been over 60,000 complaints filed or claims filed, the majority tossed out. Is this an adequate use of resources? And if not, will you actively work to change the system? Mr. Raffensperger, you first.
I think that was one of the first questions, and I would support reform, working with the General Assembly. I think that people have to understand that we live in such a mobile, dynamic society, but when we were able to fully implement ERIC, and that's really an 18 to 24-month process. So once we got the authority through House Bill 316, we began that process, but now it's fully implemented. I just wish all 50 states were part of that because it really helps us with cross-state moves and having clean voter lists. We're recognized now by the Center for Innovation Election Reform, CER, for having one of the cleanest and most accurate and accessible elections in the country, but also by Heritage on the other side. And so we've shown that we have accurate voter rolls, and we'll continue to fight for that. I also believe that annually, every county should have to do an annual list maintenance just to also be another verification for that. But like I said earlier, I want to make sure that we have accurate voter rolls, and we do.
Representative Nguyen.
Well, let's be clear. One of the reasons why, many reasons why I voted against Senate Bill 202 is because of these unlimited voter challenges. And right now in the state of Georgia, we know at least 65,000 Georgians have been challenged, including military overseas voters and college students. 37,500 challenges in Gwinnett County alone. And many of these challenges have been rejected because they do not have probable cause. Here we are taking critical election resources and addressing an issue that should not be the law of the land. And here's the thing. When asked on how to handle these mass voter election challenges, the Secretary of State's office issued a memo that basically said local election boards, figure it out yourself. But not only that, the memo had erroneous information that was contrary to our state law that suggested that in-person challenges were permittable. He then had to retract that statement because he was threatened with litigation.
Out of fairness, Mr. Metz, quickly, what is your response?
My response is the voter challenges have to maintain a clear and concise list of people that have moved out using the National Change of Address system and the Social Security death certificate system. There were over 20,000 Gwinnett County voters that had moved out prior to the election, yet they still showed up as having voted. The ERIC system is corrupt. It allows third parties access. And now that we have our voter database on the cloud, that's not secure. It allows third and fourth parties into our voter database. We need to have a secure voter database only with authorized access.
Thank you, Mr. Metz. Sorry to cut you short. 30 minutes is a short time, isn't it? Thank you so much. That is all the time we have for questions. Each candidate will now have 60 seconds for a closing statement. Representative Nguyen, you get the first closing statement.
Over 44 years ago, my parents fled their country in the middle of the night on a boat in search of basic civil liberties, including the freedom of speech, the freedom of press, and the right to free and fair elections. And right now, our basic rights are under attack, including the freedom to choose and the freedom to vote. As a lawmaker, I've witnessed Georgia Republicans and Mr. Raffensperger pass laws to make it harder for Georgians to vote. The most powerful cornerstone of our democracy is the idea of one person, one vote, that no matter where you live in the state of Georgia, the color of your skin, your religion, how much money you make, when you get to the ballot box, your vote counts exactly the same as anybody else's. I'm running for Secretary of State to protect the freedom to vote for all eligible Georgians, and I'm the only candidate on this stage who is both pro-choice and pro-democracy.
Secretary Raffensperger, your turn for a closing statement.
In the last 4 years, we've come a long way. We now have record registrations, record voter turnout. We have a verifiable paper ballot. We have some of the cleanest voter rolls in the country. And also, I report the results, and sometimes people don't like that. And I've had to stand up to the incredible pressure. And I'll continue to stand up to pressure, because when I do that, I'm standing up for you, the voter. I'm standing up for the Constitution, and I'm standing up for the rule of law. Many people buckled and folded. I didn't, and I won't. I'm going to stand for you because I feel so strongly about the rule of law. I feel so strongly about our Constitution. I feel so strongly about the right to vote. So therefore, I'm so really excited that people were talking about SB 202, how it's going to destroy and hurt turnout. And yet yesterday, we had almost double the turnout we had 4 years ago. And we'll continue to fight hard for fair and honest elections for everyone. I'm working for you, and I just asked if you'd stand with me. I'm asking for your vote. Thank you.
Ted Metz, you get the last word today. Can we have your final closing statement?
Yes. Georgia, it's time to put politics aside and vote your conscience for the best candidate. Principle over party for the preservation of our republic. Remember this when you hear a politician or a newscaster say that our democracy is at stake. Understand that democracy is 51 vegans and 49 carnivores arguing over what's for dinner. And the way things are going, we're all going to be eating crickets pretty soon. So we need to stop electing psychopaths and stop re-electing psychopaths. The truth is that our government is a republic, a nation governed by the rule of law. It's not a democracy. The threat of restoring a constitutional republic is frightening to the psychopaths. Please keep in mind the amount of money that a candidate spends to get reelected is a measure of how much they've sold us out. We got to stop electing psychopaths. They'll tell you what you want to hear and then serve themselves and the special interests that funded their campaigns. You will know them by their acts.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here today. That concludes our debate. We like to remind voters that Election Day is right around the corner, Tuesday, November 8th, and early voting has already begun. Our thanks to the candidates and to our panel of journalists this afternoon. We also like to thank the Atlanta Press Club for arranging today's debate. For more information about the debates they will host this election season, visit atlantapressclub.org/debates. I'm Lisa Ram. Thanks for joining us for the Atlanta Press Club Louder Milk Young Debate Series. Have a great afternoon.